The wind howled across the empty plains as the evening train screeched to a halt in Red Creek, a dusty town that looked smaller and sadder than the letters had promised. Clara Winslow stepped down from the last car, her gloved hands trembling as she clutched a carpet bag and the single envelope that had carried her across half the country. Inside it was a promise, a proposal from a widower named Thomas Reed, who'd written that he wanted a wife to share his small homestead, a woman who could cook, keep house, and bring warmth to the quiet land he called home. Clara had believed him. She'd believed the tender words written in an unsteady hand, the kind assurances that he'd meet her at the station with a horse and a smile. But as the last passenger walked away and the train whistle echoed down the tracks, no one came for her. The platform emptied, and the station agent, an older man with kind eyes, approached her hesitantly. "You waiting on someone, miss?" he asked. She told him the name, Thomas Reed, and watched his expression falter. He scratched the back of his neck, then finally said the words that froze her blood. "Reed won't be coming. There was a fight in the saloon 2 nights ago. He didn't make it." Clara stood still, the sound of the train leaving behind her like the final door closing. All the way from Missouri she had told herself this new life would be her chance to start over, that the West would be kinder than the past she'd fled. Now she had no fiancé, no money, and no home. Her ticket had taken everything she'd saved from her years as a seamstress. The townsfolk passing by gave her cautious glances, some curious, others pitying, but no one stopped to help. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, the wind had turned sharp and cold. The station master suggested she try the inn, but one look at the prices on the wall told her it was impossible. She thanked him politely, refusing the few coins he tried to press into her hand. Pride was all she had left. She wandered past the shuttered shops and flickering lanterns until the town gave way to open land and empty fields. The road stretched endlessly, silvered under the rising moon. At the edge of town, she found a broken wagon beside the road. Its owner was gone, but its shadow offered a little shelter from the wind. Clara sank beside it, wrapping her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She took out the letter again, reading the words she'd memorized weeks ago. "I may not have much, but I have a roof, a warm hearth, and a heart that's ready for a good woman's company." Her eyes burned, but no tears came. She'd cried too much already in her life, over a father who'd gambled away their home, over a brother who never came back from the war, over every dream that ended before it began. The prairie stretched out silent and wide, stars glinting coldly above. Clara felt smaller than ever, one more lost soul swallowed by the West. Her breath clouded in the night air, and she whispered to no one, "What do I do now?" There was no answer, only the sigh of the wind across the dry grass. Somewhere far off, a horse neighed, the sound echoing faintly. She pressed her arms around herself, fighting the creeping dread that this was how it would end for her, forgotten, alone on a strange road in a strange land. But as lightning flickered far to the west, a faint rumble of hooves drew closer. She turned toward it, squinting through the dark. A lone rider was approaching, cloak flapping against the rain that had just begun to fall. The figure slowed when he saw her, lifting his hat against the downpour. For the first time that night, Clara felt a spark of something, fear, hope, or fate, she couldn't tell. All she knew was that the stranger's voice when he spoke was steady, low, and unexpected. And it was the first voice all evening that didn't sound like pity. The rain came harder as the rider drew nearer, his horse snorting and stamping against the wind. Clara rose unsteadily, her shawl soaked through, hair clinging to her face. The man reined in beside her, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a beard touched by gray, and eyes that glimmered pale in the lightning. He studied her for a long, silent moment, saying nothing. She thought he might ride on, like everyone else had, but then he asked quietly, "You lost, ma'am?" His voice was deep, steady as the land itself, and though his tone carried no warmth, it wasn't unkind either. She told him she wasn't lost exactly, only stranded. "I came here to meet my intended," she said, voice shaking. "But he's gone. They said he passed 2 nights ago." The words sounded strange even to her ears, hollow and final. The man's jaw tightened slightly. "That's so," he murmured. He looked toward the dark horizon, then back at her, this bedraggled woman standing alone by a broken wagon, her hands trembling from the cold. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "I'll be all right," she lied. I'll find my way in the morning. The man exhaled, clearly unconvinced. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat as he said, You'll catch your death if you stay out here. My place ain't far. Got a dry roof and a fire. You can rest for the night. The offer stunned her. She'd heard stories about lonely men on the frontier, and not all of them were honorable. Yet there was something in the man's eyes, tiredness maybe, or grief, that didn't fit the danger she'd been warned about. Still, she drew herself up and said, I wouldn't want to trouble you. He gave a faint, humorless smile. You already are. Might as well do it by the fire. He swung down from his horse and offered her a hand. She hesitated before taking it. His palm was rough, calloused, and warm against her cold fingers. He lifted her onto the saddle and mounted behind her, careful not to touch her more than necessary. The horse moved steady and sure through the storm, hooves striking the muddy path as the land rolled out in darkness around them. The ride was long and silent. Clara's thoughts tangled, fear, shame, gratitude. She didn't even know his name. She dared not ask. All she could hear was the rhythmic thud of hooves, the hiss of rain, and once, faintly, the man's voice when he said, You'll be safe now. At last, the shape of a ranch house emerged through the storm, a weathered structure standing alone against the night, its windows glowing faintly with lamplight. A barn loomed behind it, the scent of wet hay thick in the air. He helped her down, guiding her under the porch where the rain eased to a soft patter. Stay here a minute, he said, and went inside. She could hear him stoking a fire, boots heavy on the wooden floor. When he returned, he gestured for her to enter. The warmth hit her like a wave. Inside, the room was plain but clean. A sturdy table, a rocking chair by the hearth, a rifle hung above the mantel. A man's home, empty of laughter or softness. He removed his coat and hat, hanging them by the door, then finally spoke again. Name's Elias Hart, he said. This place is Hart Ranch. You can sit by the fire till you're warm. Clara sank into the chair nearest the flames, her hands trembling as the heat returned to her fingers. Elias watched her for a moment, then fetched a tin cup of coffee and set it in front of her. You can stay, he said quietly, almost to himself. Just for tonight. Something in the way he said it made her heart ache, a weary loneliness she recognized. She thanked him softly, and he nodded once before retreating to the far end of the room, giving her space. Outside, the storm raged on, but for the first time in days, Clara felt a fragile sense of safety. The stranger hadn't smiled, hadn't offered comfort beyond what was needed, but his silence was steady, his kindness cautious yet real. And though she didn't know it yet, that single night beneath his roof would be the first step towards something neither of them had expected to find again, a reason to stay. Clara awoke to the faint crackle of fire and the soft scent of coffee drifting through the room. For a moment she forgot where she was. The warmth, the shelter, the quiet, all felt like a dream. Then she remembered the storm, the ride through the rain, and the man who had brought her here. Elias Hart. The name sounded as solid and lonely as the land itself. She sat up slowly, brushing her hair back and realizing she had fallen asleep in the rocking chair by the hearth. Someone had draped a blanket over her shoulders during the night. She hadn't heard him do it. The house was quiet except for the ticking of a wall clock. On the table sat a simple breakfast, biscuits, eggs, and a steaming tin cup. She hesitated before touching anything, unsure if it was meant for her. When the front door creaked open and Elias stepped in, hat in hand, she straightened instantly. His boots were muddy, his shirt damp from the morning fog. He nodded toward the plate. Go on, he said gruffly. It's for you. She murmured a shy thank you and began to eat, though she could feel his eyes on her, not in judgment, but in quiet assessment. He moved about the cabin, feeding the fire and checking the window shutters. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Clara wanted to fill it, but her words felt small against his stillness. Finally she asked, Do you live here alone? Elias paused, then nodded. Used to be different, he said simply. The weight in his tone told her not to ask more. She didn't. Instead, she told him a bit about herself, how she'd worked as a seamstress back east, how she'd answered an ad for a mail-order bride because there was nothing left for her back home. I thought maybe out here I could start over, she said softly. I just didn't expect to start over. Alone. Elias didn't look at her right away. He kept his eyes on the fire as he said, Ain't easy making a life out here. Most folks don't last. Takes grit. You seem to have that. His words, few as they were, made something inside her lift. It had been a long time since anyone had said she was strong. When she finished eating, Clara offered to wash the dishes. He didn't stop her. Watching her move quietly around his kitchen, he realized how long it had been since another soul had filled this space. The clatter of dishes, the faint hum of her voice, it all felt strange but not unwelcome. He caught himself lingering too long, then cleared his throat. "Soon as the road dries, I'll take you into town," he said. "Sheriff will know someone who can help you find work." Clara nodded, though the thought of leaving made her chest tighten. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." He shrugged, reaching for his coat. "Just doing what's right." But when she smiled faintly and said, "There's a difference between right and kind," he stopped for a second, as if unsure how to answer. The day passed slowly. She swept the floor, mended a torn curtain, and helped feed the horses despite the chill outside. Elias tried to protest, but she insisted. "It's only fair," she said, smiling a little. "You've given me a roof. I can give a hand." He didn't argue after that. As dusk settled, the wind picked up again. Elias checked the horizon and frowned. "Creek's flooded," he said quietly. "Won't be able to cross for a few days." Clara's breath caught. "You mean I can't go yet?" He looked at her then, his eyes softer than before. "Looks that way." She didn't know whether to be relieved or frightened. The house that had been a stranger's shelter now felt like something else, something uncertain and alive. As he stoked the fire again that night, Elias said the words she hadn't realized she'd been hoping to hear. "You can stay. Just for tonight." But in his voice there was hesitation, the kind that comes from a man who knows he's lying to himself. For Elias, it wasn't just kindness anymore. It was the stir of something long buried. And for Clara, the night no longer felt like borrowed time. It felt like the fragile beginning of belonging. The morning broke gray and heavy with mist, the kind that clung low to the ground and turned the pasture into a sea of fog. Clara stood on the porch, her borrowed shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, staring out at the flooded creek that glimmered like a restless snake cutting through the land. The water had swallowed the road whole, making it clear she wouldn't be leaving for days. Somewhere inside her, relief and guilt twisted together. She told herself she'd be gone as soon as she could, yet the thought of leaving the small, quiet house behind filled her with an ache she didn't want to name. Inside, Elias was already at work. She could hear him moving through the barn, the low murmur of his voice calming the horses. When he returned, brushing mud from his boots, she handed him a cup of coffee before he could ask. "You didn't have to do that," he muttered, taking it anyway. "I know," she said with a small smile. "But I wanted to." The days settled into a quiet rhythm. Clara cooked simple meals, swept the floors, and mended the worn curtains that hung crooked in the windows. Elias worked from dawn to dusk, tending fences and livestock, speaking little but always noticing what she did. Every evening he found her reading by the fire, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, her eyes half lit by the glow. The silence between them changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was a kind of peace neither had known in years, but peace never lasted long in a small town. Word spread fast, as it always did. Someone from Red Creek must have seen Elias ride through the storm with a woman behind him. A stranger, a mail-order bride whose groom had died, and now she was living alone with a man. By the third day a knock came at the door. Elias opened it to find two men from town, the storekeeper and the blacksmith, standing stiff and self-righteous on his porch. "Heard you've got company, Hart," the storekeeper said. "Folks are talking. Ain't proper, you know. A woman staying out here with you." Elias's face hardened. "What happens under my roof's no one's concern but mine." His tone was low and calm, but his hands were clenched at his sides. Clara stood quietly behind him, her face pale. The men's eyes flicked toward her, their disapproval heavy in the air. "She'll ruin her name staying here," the blacksmith said, not unkindly. "If you mean to help her, you ought to marry her or send her to the boarding house in town. Folks don't take kindly to scandal." When they left, Elias closed the door a little too hard. The silence that followed was thick and uneasy. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. "I didn't mean to bring you trouble." Elias turned to her, eyes dark. "You didn't. People just like to make trouble when they see someone trying to live quiet." He paused, then added, "You can't stay here if it'll hurt your reputation." She lifted her chin, her voice steady though her heart trembled. "I've had my name ruined before. I won't let gossip decide where I sleep." Her defiance surprised him. For the first time, he really looked at her, not as a burden, not as someone lost, but as a woman with iron beneath her gentleness. That night, neither of them slept much. Elias sat by the window long after she'd gone to her room, staring out at the moonlit floodwaters, thinking of his late wife and the years he'd spent alone. He'd built walls around his heart so high no one could climb them, until now. Clara, without even meaning to, had found a way through. In her room, Clara lay awake too, listening to the wind and the steady creak of the house. She'd never felt so safe and so frightened at once. She told herself she would leave when the water went down. But as the firelight flickered faintly through the crack beneath her door, she knew the truth. Part of her didn't want the road to clear. The next morning, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. It glinted off the flooded creek, turning the muddy water to gold. Clara stood at the window, her hands resting on the sill, wondering if the road had cleared enough for her to leave. She told herself she ought to go, that it would be best for both of them. But when she turned and saw Elias outside, mending a fence with quiet determination, her heart betrayed her. He looked so solid, so steady, like the kind of man who could hold the world together just by standing still. After breakfast, she joined him in the yard, insisting on helping. He didn't argue anymore when she offered. They worked side by side for hours, the air filled with the smell of damp earth and pine. Now and then their hands brushed. Neither spoke of it. But the silence between them wasn't cold. It pulsed with something unspoken, something neither dared name. That afternoon, a wagon rolled up the trail, kicking up dust. Elias stiffened when he recognized the man driving it, the town preacher with two others from Red Creek trailing behind. Clara's stomach dropped. She knew why they'd come before a word was spoken. "Mr. Hart," the preacher said, stepping down, his tone formal but edged with judgment. "It's been said you're housing an unwed woman out here." The town's concerned. "It's not right, not proper." His gaze flicked to Clara, softening just a little. "No one's saying you've done wrong, miss, but you're giving folks cause to talk. You understand that, don't you?" Clara tried to answer, but her throat felt tight. Elias stepped forward. "She's done nothing wrong," he said, voice calm but hard as stone. "She had nowhere to go. I gave her shelter. That's all." "That may be," the preacher replied, "but appearances matter. There's a way to make this right. You could marry her." That'd silence the talk. The words hung in the air, heavy as thunder. Elias looked at Clara then, really looked at her, and for a brief second she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something fierce and tender all at once. But he said nothing. His jaw worked, his hands fisted at his sides. The preacher waited, expectant. Clara's heart pounded. She wanted to vanish. Marriage was the last thing she wanted. Not like this, not out of pity or pressure. She found her voice, soft but firm. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I won't marry anyone because the town can't mind its own business." Elias turned toward her, surprise flashing across his face. "Clara, no," she said again, louder now. "I'm grateful for what you've done, truly. But I won't be anyone's duty. I've lived my whole life being passed from one man's mercy to another's. I won't do it again." Her words trembled, but her spine stayed straight. The preacher's brows knitted in disapproval, but he said nothing more. The men left soon after, their wagon wheels grinding against the gravel road. The silence that followed was deep and raw. Elias stood in the yard, his shoulders tense, the words he hadn't said hanging like ghosts between them. Clara turned away before he could see the tears gathering in her eyes. That evening, as dusk fell, she packed her few belongings into the worn trunk she'd carried from Missouri. The road was still muddy, the creek still high, but she couldn't stay another night under that roof. Not after what had been said, not after the way her heart had started to betray her. When Elias came in from the barn and saw her trunk by the door, his face darkened. "You're leaving," he said quietly. "Yes," she answered. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has. But I can't be the cause of your trouble." He stared at her, the muscles in his jaw tightening. For a moment, he looked like he might stop her. But all he said was, "It ain't trouble, Clara." His voice broke on her name, low and rough. "Not to me." She turned away before her resolve could crumble. "Good night, Mr. Hart," she whispered, using his name like a wall between them, And for the first time since she'd arrived, Elias let her walk past him without a word. The sound of her footsteps faded into the night, leaving the ranch quiet again. Too quiet. In her room, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the half-packed trunk. She wanted to go. She told herself she would. But when the wind rose outside and she heard Elias moving restlessly in the next room, she felt the truth heavy in her chest. She wasn't just leaving a shelter. She was leaving something she'd started to care about, something that frightened her more than loneliness ever had. The night was long and restless. Clara sat by the small window, the moonlight silvering her face as she stared at the creek glinting beyond the fields. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Elias standing in the doorway, the look in his eyes when she'd said she was leaving, like something solid inside him had cracked. She pressed her hands to her chest, trying to quiet the ache there. It didn't help. Just before dawn, she lit a lamp and took out a scrap of paper from her trunk. The edges were creased from the journey, and her hand trembled as she dipped the pen in ink. She told herself this was the right thing to do, to thank him, to end it properly, to leave nothing unsaid. The words came slowly, her script uneven. "Mr. Hart, you took me in when I had no one, and I will never forget that kindness. You gave me food, warmth, and a safe place to rest. I wish there were a way to repay you, but I have nothing to give except my gratitude. Please know that you have my prayers and my respect always. You're a good man, even if you don't believe it yourself. Clara Winslow." When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and left it on the kitchen table beside the half-empty coffee pot. The house was quiet, filled with the smell of ashes and wood smoke. She looked around once more, the chair by the fire where she'd fallen asleep that first night, the patched curtain she'd mended, the window that caught the morning light just right, and felt a strange heaviness in her chest. She lifted her trunk and carried it to the door. But as she reached for the handle, a voice stopped her. "You're really going, then?" Elias stood in the doorway to the barn, coat half-buttoned, eyes shadowed with something she couldn't name. He looked older in that moment, tired but not from work, from something deeper. "I have to," she said softly. "You know that." He stepped closer, the boards creaking under his boots. "You don't," he replied. "Not if you don't want to." She swallowed hard. "You saw what happened yesterday. The town won't forgive this, and I can't ask you to bear that burden." "I don't give a damn about what the town thinks," Elias said, his voice rougher now. "I've spent too many years caring about what can't be fixed." "Let them talk." Her eyes burned, though she tried to smile. "It isn't just the town, Elias, it's me. I can't stay where I'm not meant to belong." He was silent for a long moment. The morning light caught the lines in his face, the scars of hard years and quiet loss. "You belong more than you think," he said at last, his voice breaking low. "This house, it's been nothing but walls since my wife and boy passed. Then you came, and suddenly it felt like a home again. You made it alive." Clara's throat tightened, her breath catching in her chest. She didn't know what to say. "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't say that. It'll only make it harder. I ain't asking you to stay out of pity," he said quietly. "I'm asking because I don't want to go back to that silence. But I won't keep you if you want to go. The door's open either way." The words hung between them like smoke. She looked down at the letter on the table, the one meant to say goodbye, and for a heartbeat, she thought of tearing it up. But she couldn't trust her heart, not yet. She needed to know she could stand on her own before she let herself belong anywhere again. So she lifted her trunk once more and walked past him. Elias didn't stop her. He only stood there watching as she crossed the yard, his hands curled into fists. When the door closed behind her, the house fell silent again, save for the faint crackle of the dying fire. A few minutes later, Elias walked to the table and found the letter she'd left behind. He read it slowly, his thumb tracing the careful lines of her handwriting. Then he folded it, slipped it into his vest pocket, and whispered to the empty room, "You're wrong, Clara. You already gave me more than you know." Outside, the sun was rising, and though the road ahead was long and muddy, Clara didn't know she'd left her heart behind, sitting on the table in a letter she never truly meant to send. The town of Red Creek was already stirring when Clara arrived, her skirts muddy and her boots caked from the long walk. She kept her head down as she passed the mercantile and the saloon, feeling the sting of the townsfolk's stares. Whispers trailed behind her like smoke, some pitying, some cruel. She tried not to hear them, She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. The boarding house stood near the edge of town, a plain, creaking building with a faded sign and flower pots that hadn't seen blooms in years. Mrs. Weaver, the stout widow who ran it, eyed Clara with open suspicion when she asked for a room. "You're the one who was staying out at Hart's Ranch," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Clara lifted her chin and nodded. "Just for a few days," she said quietly. "I can pay for the week if you'll have me." Mrs. Weaver hesitated, then sighed. "You can take the back room." "But I don't want trouble, you hear? That town's full of tongues sharper than knives." Clara thanked her and carried her trunk upstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath her steps. The room was small and plain, a single bed, a cracked mirror, a window that overlooked the dusty street. It wasn't home, but it was shelter, and for now that was enough. Days passed in a blur of quiet work. She helped Mrs. Weaver scrub floors and wash linens, grateful for the distraction. Yet every night, as she lay in the narrow bed, she saw the ranch in her mind, the long stretch of pasture, the sound of wind in the pines, the steady rhythm of Elias's voice when he spoke her name. She told herself it would fade with time, but it didn't. One morning, while hanging laundry behind the house, she heard hoofbeats approach. Her hands froze around the wet sheet as a familiar figure rode into view. Elias. His horse was dusty, his hat pulled low, but she knew him instantly. Her heart gave a painful jolt. He dismounted slowly, as if uncertain whether to come closer. "Mrs. Weaver said I'd find you out back," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to cause a scene." Clara set down the laundry basket, her pulse fluttering. "Why are you here?" He took a breath, eyes steady on hers. "Because the house don't feel right without you. I've spent years trying to forget what it's like to have someone to talk to laugh with. You came along and reminded me I ain't dead inside after all. Then you left, and it was like the silence came back twice as loud." She looked down, torn between pride and longing. "You don't owe me that, Elias. You gave me shelter when I needed it." "That was enough. I'm not here because I owe you," he said, his voice rough. "I'm here because I want you to come back. Not as some charity case, not to quiet the town's gossip. Come back because you want to. Because maybe that place feels like home to you, same as it does to me now." His words hit her harder than she expected. For a long moment she couldn't speak. The wind lifted her hair, carrying the scent of dust and summer rain. "You're asking me to come back," she said finally. "But not to marry you?" He gave a faint, crooked smile. "I'll ask if you want me to. But first, I just want you to choose it. Not out of duty, out of want." Something inside her cracked, the wall she'd built to protect what little was left of her heart. She realized that for all her talk of independence, what she'd really been afraid of was needing someone again. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You always did make it hard to say no." Elias exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in weeks. "So you'll come back?" Clara smiled through the tears that had begun to fall. "Yes, but this time not as a guest, as someone who belongs." He nodded once as if that was all he'd been waiting to hear. He offered his hand, and when she took it, something in the air shifted, quiet and sure. The loneliness that had haunted both of them for years began to lift. As they rode back toward the ranch, the sun broke fully through the clouds. The fields shimmered gold again, and Clara realized she'd been wrong about one thing. She hadn't lost everything when she came west. She'd simply taken the long way home. The sky stretched wide and golden above the Hart Ranch as Clara and Elias rode side by side, the scent of sun-warmed grass heavy in the air. The ranch house came into view, its roof glinting under the late afternoon sun, and Clara felt her throat tighten. It looked both familiar and strange, like a place from a dream she hadn't dared to believe she'd see again. When they reached the yard, Elias dismounted first and turned to help her down. His hand was warm and steady, and when her boots touched the ground, she didn't let go right away. Neither did he. For a moment they just stood there, the wind whispering through the dry prairie grass. "I half expected you to change your mind halfway here," he said, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. Clara shook her head. "I've done enough running for a lifetime." She looked up at the porch, where she'd once stood trembling and lost, asking for shelter. "You said I could stay for one night," she murmured. "I didn't realize then that one night would change everything." Elias's eyes softened. "Neither did I." Inside, the house was the same, simple, well kept, but no longer cold. A fire burned in the hearth, the scent of pinewood smoke curling through the air. The table was set for two, as if Elias had been waiting for this moment, whether he'd admit it or not. Clara ran her hand along the back of the chair she'd once sat in, feeling a rush of memories, her first meal here, her nervous laughter, the quiet way he'd watched her from across the table. He moved closer, his voice low. "You know, when you left, I thought I'd done the right thing. I told myself I wasn't the kind of man a woman like you should be tied to. But every morning after that, I'd wake up and reach for a voice that wasn't there, a laugh that had gone quiet." Clara turned to face him. "You think I didn't miss you?" Every night, I'd hear that wind howling outside the boarding house and wonder if it sounded the same here. I told myself I didn't belong anywhere, but truth is, I just didn't want to belong somewhere I could lose again. He reached out then, brushing a stray curl from her cheek. "You don't have to be afraid of that anymore." Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the fragile hope that had been growing inside her since the day she left. "So, what happens now?" she asked softly. Elias hesitated, then smiled, a small, uncertain thing that carried more emotion than words could. "Now we start over, not as strangers, not as a man and woman bound by kindness or guilt, but as two people who've been lonely long enough." He pulled a small box from his vest pocket, simple, worn, but clearly cherished. Inside was a ring, plain silver with a tiny engraving along the band. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "Didn't think I'd ever have a reason to use it again." Clara gasped softly, her hand trembling as he held it out to her. "Elias!" "You don't have to answer now," he added quickly. "Just stay. Stay longer than one night." Clara looked up at him through tears, then smiled, a smile that reached her eyes, bright and sure. "I already have." He slipped the ring onto her finger, his rough hand steady against hers. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and earth, the promise of new beginnings. That evening they stood together on the porch, watching the horizon fade into hues of amber and violet. The land stretched before them, wild, vast, and full of life. For the first time, neither of them felt small against it. Elias glanced at her, the faintest hint of wonder in his voice. "Funny thing," he said. "I thought I was just giving you a roof for the night." Clara leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "And I thought I was just finding a place to sleep." She smiled, her voice soft. "Turns out we both found home." As the first stars appeared, Elias wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. The silence that had once haunted the house was gone, replaced by something warmer, something alive. The lonely rancher was lonely no more, and the mail-order bride had finally found the place she was meant to stay. Not just for one night, but for a lifetime.